Hey, nerds. So, I'm going to continue my series. I'm almost all the way through this short book by Foucault, The History of Sexuality, an Introduction, Volume 1. Of course, he's the infamous 70s pervert, my favorite infamous 70s pervert post-structuralist philosopher who was a gay guy who was into BDSM who died from AIDS. But anyway, so well, he's going to get into what I think is like the most brilliant steelman I've ever seen of a very serious and detailed and like seemingly accurate criticism of his view of sexuality. But he gets into a response to this after, and I'm going to make a separate video on that. But this is really interesting. But anyway, before I get into it, if you order anything at all on Amazon through my link, and you go through my link and change it to any other item, I get a little kickback and no extra cost to you. So please do that if you're ordering anything. And if you want to give me a little tip on Patreon for each individual post, that's greatly appreciated as well. Or you can give me any amount of money per month, 1, 5, 10, or anything. That's greatly appreciated as well. And like, subscribe, share, of course. Subscribe in particular. That helps a lot. And also subscribe to my Rumble page. All those links are in the description. All right, so I'm going to get into it here. A super long paragraph, as of course Foucault, we know, likes to be verbose and obtuse, right? So he's going to get into basically like take possible criticisms of his view very seriously in terms of basically like sexuality and the culture of sexuality during the Enlightenment in relation to modern mechanisms of power, which you could say are the church, the state, and science, or like government and religion and science, specifically psychology and psychiatry and biology, right? And well, more like psychiatry in particular. Like, he talks a lot, as we know, about this creation of the category of homosexuals that had never existed before. There were, of course, gay people, but the category of homosexual was created in order to label gay people as literally medically flawed and insane, to the point that if you have any ancestors, that makes you a pervert, and that means that if you have any ancestors, they're also going to be perverts, and they're going to have fucked up children, basically. You're so you're insane, biologically flawed, a sin in your existence, according to religion, specifically the Christian church we're probably talking about, right? And your existence is illegal. So if you're a gay guy, and he specifically is talking about the 1700s in this paragraph, then you are biologically flawed, a sin, and a crime. All right, so yeah, that's one of the good examples I like to use to illustrate his points about sexuality and the mechanisms of power, of the institutions of the modern era. And of course, like, he's not a Marxist, right? Anti-government, anti-religion, and not anti-science, but anti like this view of psychology, this antiquated view, right? All right, so anyway, I'm gonna get into the paragraph here. Okay. People are going to say that I'm dealing in a historicism. So, historicism, of course, this idea, basically somewhat accurate idea, but people can take it too far, of course, that our view of history is contextually dependent based on a whole bunch of different factors that can affect our view of it, right? Which totally makes sense, of course. And Slavoj Žižek talks about that, of course, a lot, who I've mentioned before, Hegelian slash my favorite slash Hegelian slash Lacanian slash Marxist, and the only one I know of who talks like this and so on and blah blah blah. All right, so anyway, people are going to say that I'm dealing in a historicism which is more careless than radical. So I don't think he's necessarily trying to be radical, but it sounds radical, right? But they're saying, like, he's saying that his critics would say that his view is uh careless. I wouldn't say that at all, but he does point out a point that he could possibly be missing here. All right. So the people are going to say that I'm dealing in a historicism which is more careless than radical, that I'm evading the biologically established existence of sexual functions for the benefit of okay, so evading the biologically established existence of sexual functions. He means, like, anatomically speaking and from an evolutionary biology perspective, the anatomical purpose of penises and vaginas, that sort of thing, right? So basically, they're saying that his hypothetical critic here is saying that he's ignoring that. So that I'm evading the biologically established existence of sexual functions for the benefit of phenomena that are variable perhaps, but fragile, secondary, and ultimately superficial. So he's talking about basically this hypothetical critic of his is basically saying that he is ignoring the evolutionary biology and anatomical aspects of literally sex, not sexuality, and focusing more on, like, culturally and historically contingent phenomena about the power of this view of sexuality conveyed through the state, the church, and science, all three of those institutions. So that I'm baiting the biologically established existence of sexual functions for the benefit of phenomena that are variable, perhaps, but fragile, secondary, and ultimately superficial. Yeah, because obviously things like laws, facts according to science, and rules of religions can vary and change throughout history as they do, right? Okay, so that I'm evading the biologically established existence of sexual functions for the benefit of phenomena that are variable, perhaps, but fragile, secondary, and ultimately superficial, and that I speak of sexuality as if sex does not exist. So, this hypothetical critic is basically saying, in terms of speaking of sexuality as if sex does not exist, he means, like, sexuality in terms of, like, you're only looking at it from basically a cultural perspective, or you could see, say, a historiographic perspective, because technically, uh, Foucault was a historiographer because he looked at basically cultural and philosophical issues within specific historical contexts. But anyway, sexuality while ignoring sex. So, like, the sexuality from a cultural perspective, while ignoring the evolutionary biology and anatomical physical aspects of sex, right? As we were saying. All right. So, and ultimately superficial, and that I speak of sexuality as if sex does not exist. And one would be entitled to object as follows. Um, this is a long hypothetical quote that he gets into, but he gets into basically, like, literally what verbatim one of his critics might say. You claim to analyze in detail the processes by which women's bodies, the lives of children, family relationships, and an entire network of social relations were sexualized. Yeah, basically, his theory that during the Enlightenment, specifically the 1600s through the 18th, 1800s, I should say, sexualization of women's bodies, like, basically this idea in science, religion, and law that looking at women's bodies sexually is evil, and you're a pervert, and it's illegal for women to, like, expose themselves in public, that sort of shit. This uh, this sort of thing is the sexualization of women in particular. And then in terms of the lives of children, we're talking about sexualizing children in, like, a perverted sexual way in order to diagnose people as perverts and put them in these categories so they can be labeled as biologically flawed, a sin, and a crime. And that's not saying he's defending pedophilia or anything like that. But the point is that, like, he's basically arguing that before this, historically speaking. Of course, there were pedophiles, but culturally, people did not look at children sexually. They looked at them as children. So it's another way in which he would probably imply that this Enlightenment view sexualized people in a way that they have never been sexualized before, which was bad for gay people and bad for children and bad for families and bad for women. Um, and so in terms of family relationships, for example, he's talking about this, obviously it was before this concept existed, but this idea of the nuclear family, this, hierarchical structure of the man being the head of the household and the wife taking care, and the wife taking care of everything at home while the man works and the children are obedient and do what they're told. And the family is sexualized and that the the man and the wife have sex and the children are looked at sexually in terms of culture by society, even though they never were before, but they're still separately distinguished as children. Children are distinguished from adults, but during the Enlightenment, these institutions caused children to be looked at as more sexualized than they ever had been before in human history. All right, so and one would be entitled to object as follows. You claim to analyze in detail the processes by which women's bodies, the lives of children, family relationships, and an entire network of social relations were sexualized. We got into that in terms of the culture of the institutions of religion, science, and law or government, right? An entire network of social relations were sexualized. You wish to describe that great awakening of sexual concern since the 18th century and her growing eagerness to suspect the presence of sex in everything. So basically, this idea that Foucault talks about in terms of like adding this view of sexuality to everything and this growing paranoia of the snooty Enlightenment culture where you see sex and everything and you see this evil, medically evil, religiously evil, government illegal uh sexuality and everything everywhere. Oh, these women are showing their knees. The men are going to go crazy. That's evil. All kinds of crazy shit like that, right? Okay. So you wish to describe that great awakening of sexual concern since the 18th century and her growing eagerness to suspect the presence of sex in everything. Let us admit as much and suppose that the mechanisms of power were in fact used more to arouse and excite sexually than to repress it. So this is interesting. So in terms of the mechanisms of power, again, he's talking about institutions of the modern era. There are others, of course, but the main ones I talk about that he often talks about are religion, science, and government. So these so these mechanisms of power through the culture of sex. So these institutions of science, religion, and government convey through mechanisms of power a way of social control over the culture in a way that makes people paranoid and see sex everywhere. But this hypothetical critic is saying that what if these mechanisms of power are conveying a social message about sex in that way, but they're actually like sexualizing things in a positive way, to excite sexuality rather than to repress it. So rather than this idea of seeing seeing sex everywhere and being paranoid about it because it's scary because these mechanisms of power don't like it, um that then this you see sex everywhere but it's meant to excite you. It's like the increase, as people know about, as conservatives endlessly complain, like the sexualization of culture. Like, nowadays we would talk about things like OnlyFans, but some of it was, I don't know, like burlesque shows or some shit. It depends on what period of history we're talking about and what location, right? So they're saying, what if these mechanisms of power are not just proposing paranoia, but also exciting people? But I mean, you can anticipate Foucault's reaction to this, or response to this, I should say, from, if you remember what we talked about earlier in terms of how these modern institutions convey their message of sexuality through the mechanisms of power. Foucault would say that it's not just that it makes the whole society paranoid about sexuality, it simultaneously gets everyone all horny, well it gets everyone horny while simultaneously condemning people for getting horny. It's these two different things that are playing off of each other, these two different active aspects of culture conveyed through mechanisms of power. He's clarified that before, right? It's complex, but he says that. But so this critic might be addressing a straw man, but he's still making a fair criticism here. Like, what if these mechanisms of power are being used by these moderns of institution, but they're actually not making people paranoid at all? They're not making people repressed. They're just exciting sexuality and making sexuality more of a good thing, which you could perhaps argue due to the increased secularization of culture during the Enlightenment, right? All right, so um, let us admit as much and suppose that the mechanisms of power were in fact used more to arouse and excite sexually than repress it. But here you remain quite near to the thing you no doubt believe you have gotten away from. So you're doing the exact thing. You're criticizing these mechanisms of power of the modern institution of doing, right? You remain quite near to the thing you no doubt believe you have gotten away from. At bottom, when you point out phenomena of diffusion, anchorage, and fixation of sexuality, these cultural aspects, you were trying to reveal what may be called the organization of erotic zones in the social body. So, like, in the culture, different parts of the culture that look at specifically like men, women, family, and children specifically in different ways, but separately. So these are different so-called erotic zones of people that are like looking at people in the culture sexually. You could basically say. So you're trying to reveal what might be called the organization of erotic zones in the social body. It may well be the case that you've done nothing more than transpose to the level of diffuse processes mechanisms which psychoanalysis has identified with precision at the level of the individual. I'm going to read that again. It may well be the case that you've done nothing more than transpose to the level of diffuse processes mechanisms which psychoanalysis has identified with precision at the level of the individual. Oh, okay. So I think he's saying that his critic would say that he's like paradoxically, or perhaps like yeah, like his view of postmodernism, you could say, or sexuality in relation to power specifically is backfiring on him and accomplishing the very goal that he is saying is bad and is accusing his critics of doing. Well, not his critics, but the people he is criticizing. Okay, so basically what this hypothetical critic is saying is that you're not actually like you're not actually like looking at this more culturally in supposedly ignoring or belittling the evolutionary biological and anatomical aspects of sex in relation to actual sexuality. You're actually making this psychologized view of conveyed through the mechanisms of power of science, religion, and government, but in specifically this case, science. You're actually making it sound more legitimized where you're talking about these cultural aspects, because these cultural aspects of the way that sexuality is looked at biologically seems to make the biology more feasible if you're talking about it in terms of the reason for the ways in which we look at biological actions, right? So you could say that it's actually giving more credence to the argument rather than criticizing it, right? You see what he's talking about there? It's a very complex criticism. All right. So at bottom, when you point out phenomena of diffusion, anchorage, and fixation of sexuality, you were trying to reveal what be called the organization of erotic zones in the social body. It may well be the case that you've done nothing more than transpose to the level of diffuse processes mechanisms which psychoanalysis has identified with precision at the level of the individual. But you pass over the thing on the basis of which this sexualization was able to develop and which psychoanalysis does not fail to recognize, namely sex. So basically, when Foucault was talking about the sexuality in terms of psychoanalysis and Freud specifically, he's getting into here. He's saying he's saying that psychoanalysis ignores sex, but this hypothetical critic is saying that it doesn't. It's hyperfixated on it, which Foucault actually does say at one point. So it's a bit of a straw man. But you see what he's saying there, though, right? I'll read this again. You pass over the thing on the basis of which this sexualization was able to develop and which psychoanalysis does not fail to recognize, namely sex. So you're passing over sex. You're ignoring the sex and the connection between sex and sexuality that Freud talks about. That's what they're saying. He's not, but that's what the critic is saying. And it is a very good sounding criticism, you have to say, for sure. Okay, before Freud, one sought to localize sexuality as closely as possible in sex, more physically, right? In its reproductive functions, in its immediate anatomical localizations. One fell back upon a biological minimum, organ, instinct, and finality, these biological functions of sexuality in terms of sex. You, on the other hand, are in a symmetrical and inverse position. So you're not looking at this physically at all. You're looking at it culturally, basically. You, on the other hand, are in a symmetrical and inverse position. For you, there remain only groundless effects, ramifications without roots, a sexuality without sex. So basically, they're saying that he's saying that it's all cultural. It's like none of it or very little of it is cultural, but the way we there is the physical, but the way we analyze the physical is all determined by our cultural perspective of it, which is true, but they're being hyperbolic about presenting his view in a way. So there remain only groundless effects, ramifications without roots, a sexuality without sex, with none of these other aspects, anatomical localizations, reproductive functions, etc. Right? Okay. For you, there remain only groundless effects, ramifications without roots, a sexuality without sex. What if this is not castration once it gets? So, of course, he's using this in like the typical Foucault philosopher way. He's using it metaphorically, like castration in terms of he's talking about these. So, for the purposes of this paragraph, we'll talk about specifically the medicalized view in psychiatry of sexuality. This critic is saying that he is saying that this psychiatry view castrates itself because it removes from its analysis the culture of sexuality and it only looks at it physically, which isn't really accurate. But it's only half of his point because he thinks the physical is important. He thinks that, but the culture is more important because that not determines, but it heavily influences how we analyze sex rather than sexuality, which is totally true, right? But so this hypothetical critic is saying that he's actually castrating himself in exactly the way that he thinks the psychiatrists are criticizing themselves. So again, he thinks that the so again his hypothetical critic is saying that Foucault thinks that psychiatry is castrating itself by looking at psychiatry only from a physical perspective and not a cultural perspective. But in reality, he is actually castrating himself by looking at it only culturally and not physically. Of course, this is an oversimplification, but this is actually a really good steelman argument. Like, you don't see that nowadays. And I don't make an effort because of my ego, probably, but it is really good to hear Steelman. So Foucault offers a brilliant response, and I give some hints here about some like sort of inaccurate criticisms of his hypothetical opponent. But yeah, anyway, in a nutshell, Foucault offers a really great and brilliant criticism of himself and his own view on sexuality and the mechanisms of power in relation to postmodernism. All right, so yeah, So everyone like, subscribe, share, subscribe in particular. That really helps a lot. And if you order anything at all on Amazon through my link, you can click on the link for whatever's there and then switch it to any other item. And you order, I get a little kickback and no extra cost to you. You can give me a tip for each individual post on Patreon if you don't want to give me amount of money per month, or you can give me $1, $5, 10, 15, any amount of money you want on Patreon, and subscribe to my Rumble page too, please. All those links are in the description. All right. So yeah, this is a really elaborate and detailed description of how Foucault castrated himself.